$1 billion deal, years of promises. And now, silence. The Philippines has pulled the plug on Chinese-funded infrastructure projects, and Beijing's response was immediate. But this story is about far more than railways and ports. It is about sovereignty, strategy, and who controls one of the most contested waters on Earth. To understand what is happening in the Philippines today, you first need to understand where it sits on the map, and why that matters enormously to the rest of the world. The Philippines is an archipelago nation of more than 7,600 islands, positioned at the very heart of Southeast Asia. It borders the South China Sea, one of the most critical maritime trade routes on the planet, through which an estimated $5 trillion in global trade passes every single year. That geography makes the Philippines not just a regional player, but a geopolitical prize. And for years, China has known it. Beijing claims nearly the entire South China Sea under what it calls the Nine-Dash Line, a sweeping territorial boundary that overlaps the exclusive economic zones of multiple nations, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled that China's Nine-Dash Line claim had no basis in international law. It was a landmark legal decision. China ignored it entirely. For ordinary Filipinos, the consequences of this dispute are not abstract. Fishermen in the South China Sea have reported being blocked, harassed, and driven from waters their families have fished for generations. Resupply missions to Filipino outposts have been met with water cannons and deliberate obstruction from Chinese Coast Guard vessels. The frustration in Manila is palpable. Citizens who once welcomed the promise of Chinese-funded roads, railways, and bridges now speak of broken commitments and unanswered questions. Where did the money go? Why were the projects never built? And at what cost did their government court Beijing's favor? These are the questions being asked in homes, in markets, and in the halls of the Philippine Senate. The roots of this moment stretch back to 2016, when Rodrigo Duterte won the Philippine presidency and made a dramatic and deeply controversial foreign policy pivot. Duterte turned away from the United States, the Philippines' long-standing treaty ally, and moved toward China. He shelved the arbitration ruling. He welcomed Chinese investment. He spoke warmly of Beijing at a time when tensions in the South China Sea were at a peak. In exchange, China promised billions of dollars in infrastructure investment under Duterte's flagship Build program, including 3 major railway projects totaling nearly $5 billion. His supporters argued this was pragmatic statecraft. Why antagonize a powerful neighbor when economic partnership was on offer? His critics warned of a different outcome entirely. Philippine senators raised alarms about the loan terms attached to Chinese financing. Interest rates of around 3%, compared to as low as 0.1% offered by Japan. The numbers, they argued, told a troubling story about long-term debt and dependency. And as the years passed, the promised Chinese projects failed to materialize. By the end of Duterte's term in June 2022, not one of the 3 flagship railway projects had seen significant progress. The promises had not been kept. Perhaps no international example cast a longer shadow over the Philippine debate than the story of Sri Lanka. In 2017, Sri Lanka, unable to repay its debts to Chinese state-owned enterprises, was forced to hand over the Hambantota port on a 99-year lease to a Chinese company. The port had been built with Chinese loans. Now it belonged, in all practical terms, to China. For many Filipinos and their elected representatives, that image of Hambantota became a warning, a cautionary tale about what infrastructure deals can look like when the debt becomes unmanageable and the leverage shifts. The strategic alarm bells grew even louder when Chinese companies began expressing interest in Subic Bay, a former United States naval base, and one of the most strategically significant deep-water ports in all of Asia. The thought of Subic Bay following the path of Hambantota was, for many in Manila, simply unacceptable. When Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected president in mid-2022, the Philippines entered a new chapter and chose a fundamentally different direction. Where Duterte had prioritized economic favor from Beijing, Marcos prioritized something else: sovereignty. In October 2023, the Marcos administration formally canceled Chinese funding for all three major railway projects. The era of Chinese-funded infrastructure as a pillar of Philippine development policy was officially over. Analysts described the decision as significant not only for what it ended, but for what it signaled. The cancellations coincided with a marked escalation of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard vessels had been using water cannons against Philippine resupply boats. Filipino fishermen were being blocked. And at Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines deliberately keeps the aging naval vessel BRP Sierra Madre grounded as a territorial marker, confrontations were becoming more frequent and more dangerous. Manila made a calculated decision to go public with these incidents, a transparency strategy designed to build international awareness and diplomatic pressure around China's behavior. It worked. The world began paying attention. The Philippines is now pursuing what analysts call a strategy of external balancing, building a network of powerful allies to offset China's growing pressure. The United States and the Philippines have expanded their mutual defense cooperation significantly, with plans for up to 500 joint military activities annually. American access to Philippine military bases has been broadened. The U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, which commits Washington to respond if the Philippines comes under armed attack, has been publicly reaffirmed. But Manila has not stopped there. Japan, Australia, Canada, and India have all been drawn into a growing web of security partnerships with the Philippines. The message being sent to Beijing is deliberate. The Philippines is not alone, and it will not be isolated. Meanwhile, the 2016 arbitration ruling, the legal decision China dismissed and ignored, has become a central tool in Manila's diplomatic and rhetorical arsenal. Every time China acts aggressively in the South China Sea, the Philippines invokes international law. Every incident is documented, shared, and presented to the world as evidence of Beijing's disregard for the rules-based international order. It is a battle being fought not just on the water, but in courtrooms, press conferences, and the court of global opinion. The Philippines' decision to cancel Chinese infrastructure deals is more than an economic policy shift. It is a statement of identity, a declaration that sovereignty cannot be purchased, and a signal to the region and the world that small nations, even when facing the pressure of a much larger power, can choose a different path. The South China Sea remains deeply contested. The confrontations at Second Thomas Shoal continue. China has not changed its position and shows no indication of doing so. But something has shifted in Manila. A nation that once weighed economic promises against territorial rights has made its choice. And in doing so, it has positioned itself at the center of one of the defining geopolitical stories of this century. The contest between a rising power seeking dominance and a sovereign nation insisting on its rights under international law. The deal may be dead, but the story is very much alive. This is your news update.